Great. My name is John Surrick. I'm Director of Media Relations at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. I want all to note that this Zoom event is being recorded. It will be available on our website approximately an hour after the meeting is concluded. For those who want to go see it, the address is cbf.org/NOICALL. I want to thank the reporters for attending. This is a new world for CBF, and I ask for your understanding as we work through the call. All reporters will be on mute until after the opening remarks. The agenda today is first you'll hear from CBF President Will Baker and VP for Litigation John Mueller, then Maryland Attorney General Frosh, Virginia Attorney General Herring, District of Columbia Attorney General Racine, and Anne Arundel County Executive Pittman. Reporters should note that we're going to use chat for you to let me know that you'd like to ask a question. You don't need to put the question in the chat, just let us know you have one. We will unmute one reporter at a time, but all reporters will also have to unmute themselves. There's a little blue button you should see. Once you're live, please identify yourself, your affiliation, and who you would like to address. You'll stay unmuted in the event a follow-up is desired. If not, say thanks and we'll move to the next question. If reporters have additional questions, you can let me know in the chat function. Basics being taken care of, I'd like to introduce Will Baker, CBF President, and John Mueller, who will follow up with him, who is our Vice President for Litigation. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, John. And for those of us who are panelists and we're not muted, if you do have background noise, you might want to mute until you start. So I'm Will Baker, President of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Thanks for all who have joined us. Today we are issuing a notice of intent to sue EPA for failing to enforce the Clean Water Act. The Maryland Watermen's Association, Anne Arundel County, and Virginia cattle farmer Bobby Whitescarver are joining us in signing the notice of intent. EPA has failed to fulfill its Clean Water Act requirements to reduce pollution throughout the Bay watershed, a 64,000 square mile watershed that is a national treasure. Specifically, EPA has refused to require Pennsylvania and New York to develop pollution reduction plans consistent with the Chesapeake Clean Water Blueprint. Underscoring the importance of holding EPA accountable, attorneys generals of Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia are also filing a notice of intent to sue. I've been working for CBF for over 40 years, and I have never seen such a concerted effort to require the federal government to do its job to reduce Bay pollution. We're grateful. Filing notices of intent is a legal requirement of the Clean Water Act and the first step towards litigation. EPA has 60 days to resolve concerns before plaintiffs can sue. While we hope EPA will do its job, I believe it's unlikely. A CBF delegation and I met with Administrator Wheeler on this subject over a year ago. He voiced little interest in addressing our concerns. And now, John Mueller, Vice President of Litigation for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. John?
Thank you, Will. John Mueller here. I'd like to provide a little background and the basis for our action today. In 2000, Congress revised the Clean Water Act to require EPA to hold the states accountable for developing and implementing plans to save the Chesapeake Bay. When insufficient progress was made, in 2009, we sued EPA for failing to undertake the actions we were supposed to undertake under the Clean Water Act. We settled that case, and in the settlement agreement, EPA agreed to develop the Chesapeake Bay TMDL and did so and issued that in December. The TMDL specifies the amount of pollution each jurisdiction may discharge and requires the development of implementation plans to meet those limits by 2025. Then in 2014, the Bay States and EPA signed the Chesapeake Bay Agreement. There, the states committed to developing individual plans and milestones for measuring progress to achieve the pollution limits by 2025. In that process, EPA committed to hold the states accountable and impose consequences should they fail to reach their goals. Together, the pollution limits, restoration plans, milestones to measure progress, and consequences make up what we call the Chesapeake Clean Water Blueprint. Now back to Will.
Thanks, John. The blueprint John mentions is a federal-state agreement basically to save the bay. It's different from prior agreements because it has teeth and it's working. Pollution is going down, underwater grasses and blue crabs are coming up. The federal courts have repeatedly upheld the legality of the blueprint. The blueprint is our best and perhaps last chance to save the bay. But now it's at risk due to EPA's unwillingness to address major deficiencies in the final plan submitted by Pennsylvania and New York. EPA's failure to hold Pennsylvania and New York accountable undermines the very integrity of this historic federal-state partnership. EPA seems intent on snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. EPA is rejecting a specific requirement by Congress to reduce pollution. We're fully prepared to file suit after 60 days if EPA does not act. Then it will be up to the courts to compel EPA to do its job. Clean water for our children and clean water for our grandchildren will be the reward. John, back to you.
Thank you, Will and John. Next, we have Maryland Attorney General Frosh.
Good morning. Am I unmuted?
You are.
Okay, good. I'm proud to join with our partners, Attorney General Mark Herring of Virginia and Attorney General Karl Racine of the District of Columbia, and also with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and County Executive Steuart Pittman. Both of my colleagues, Generals Racine and Herring, have been champions of environmental protection and a clean Chesapeake Bay. And of course, Chesapeake Bay Foundation's mission is to save the bay. As Will said earlier, the Chesapeake Bay is a national treasure. 4 centuries ago, Captain John Smith described his initial incursion into the bay as seeing that abundance of fish lying so thick with their heads above water that they tried to catch them with a frying pan. In those days, oyster reefs crested the waves. In 1940, H.L. Mencken said that the bay was an immense protein factory. But today, those abundances have been squandered. Oysters survive only at about 1% of their former numbers, and many species are gone altogether. And the remaining fish, crabs, subaquatic vegetation are all under constant threat. We've fought to bring the Chesapeake Bay back to health. Maryland has engaged in heroic efforts and made huge sacrifices. The bay literally divides our state in two, but this is a struggle we cannot win without the commitment of our neighbors and, more importantly, without the engagement of the United States Environmental Protection Agency. The Clean Water Act charges EPA, and I'm quoting here, to ensure that management plans are developed and implementation is begun by the signatories of the Bay Agreement to achieve and maintain the pollution diets that are called for by that agreement. The EPA has flat out walked away from that responsibility. The plans submitted by Pennsylvania and New York do not even purport to make the pollution reductions necessary to meet the requirements of the Bay Agreement and the EPA has done nothing. The Trump administration from the early days of Scott Pruitt has undermined our critical protections from pollution in the air and in the water. They have sought to reduce standards for air pollution and water pollution from every source imaginable. It has also cut the budget for the Chesapeake Bay program in its entirety. Thankfully, it was restored by a bipartisan effort in the United States Congress. EPA's refusal to enforce the Bay Agreement is the most direct and most dangerous example of its failure of stewardship of the Bay. We'll never save the Bay without federal leadership. That's why Maryland, the District of Columbia, and Virginia, and the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and its cohorts will ask the courts to order EPA to do its job. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney General Frosh. Next, we have Virginia Attorney General Harry.
Well, thank you. And first of all, I want to thank everyone for joining on the call. And I want to thank my colleagues, General Frosh and General Racine, as well as the Chesapeake Bay Foundation for being such fantastic partners in our shared mission of saving the Bay. Chesapeake Bay is one of Virginia's and our nation's most important natural resources, and it adds billions to our Commonwealth's economy through industries like fishing, recreation, real estate, tourism, and many others. But for too long, we were not protecting the Bay the way we should have in a lot of ways. We were allowing massive amounts of pollution to enter its waters, decimating populations and wildlife and destroying ecosystems. Fortunately, because of agreements like the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement, we have made incredible progress toward improving and restoring the health of the Bay. Populations of species that were once in rapid decline are now coming back at incredible rates. Blue crabs, oysters, clams, and many others are starting to flourish. The waters are healthier today than they have been in decades. But we still have a lot of work to do before we can declare victory. And we cannot allow the progress that we have made to backslide or even to stagnate. Collectively, we've got a huge responsibility to take care of this national environmental treasure. And that means that we, as the watershed states, need to adhere to the terms of the Watershed Agreement. We have to do everything we can to restore the Chesapeake Bay's a healthy trajectory. That means also, as administrator of the agreement, the EPA has to enforce its terms. And the EPA has to treat all of the watershed states and partners equally and make sure that each is pulling its own weight. It means that the EPA has to make sure that each is upholding its agreed upon plan. Instead, the Trump EPA is rubber stamping plans that are plainly inadequate and allowing some watershed states to do less than what they're supposed to. And because they have failed, the Trump EPA has failed, we must take action to stop the Trump EPA from shirking its responsibilities to protect the Chesapeake Bay. We need to continue the gains that we've made, restore the Bay, its waters, its wildlife, its animals and plants to their full potential. Hopefully, we will be able to reach an understanding that will be workable and beneficial for all, while at the same time, keeping the health of the Chesapeake Bay at the forefront.
Thank you. Attorney General Racine. You appear to be on mute.
You missed an eloquent opening, gentlemen and ladies. No, let me first thank Will Baker and John Mueller and the Chesapeake Bay Foundation for your decades of leadership and work to restore the bay and protect its watershed. Also want to thank County Executive Pittman for joining us, and of course, my two colleagues in the AG space, Attorney General Frosh and the Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Virginia, Mark Herring. It's always with you, especially when it concerns our shared natural resources. I do also want to emphasize that the DC Director of Department of the Energy and Environment, Tommy Wells, wanted to be sure that I communicated his commitment and that of his agency to work with you shoulder to shoulder in what we'll be ready for, which is hard litigation against the Trump administration. As Attorney General Frosh and Attorney General Herring earlier explained, we're prepared to sue the EPA because it is failing to enforce the law. The EPA obligation to make sure states work together to meet the pollution reduction goals of the Chesapeake Watershed Agreement. Right now, the EPA is walking away from that obligation. Without EPA's oversight, it will be impossible for the Bay and all the states in its watershed to reach its objectives and we've been working for decades. Rivers in 6 states in the District of Columbia, including the Potomac River, flow into the Chesapeake Bay and bring harmful nutrient pollution with them. This contamination comes from common sources: farm fertilizer runoff, wastewater treatment plants, stormwater discharges, and more. This causes algae blooms, which block sunlight, use up oxygen, and creates dead zones where plants and animals cannot survive. And of course, the human beings are also the sufferers. The states, the district, and the federal government have been working together since the 1980s to restore the bay and to reduce pollution that harms all of our waters. The EPA has historically played an important role in ensuring that the Bay States, all of us, do our part. Indeed, in 2010, we agreed to and began implementing a plan which set pollution levels for the entire watershed aimed to restore the Bay by 2025. In a departure from its historic oversight role, the EPA has allowed other states to submit weak pollution reduction plans that will undermine our ability to reach our goals. The Bay States and the EPA previously understood the 2025 goals as a shared responsibility. Now, the EPA is saying that these goals are simply aspirational. This is yet another disturbing example of how President Trump's EPA is abandoning its responsibilities and undermining environmental protections. The District of Columbia is committed to reaching our own pollution reduction goals, but if other states aren't pulling their weight and the EPA isn't keeping watch, this becomes more difficult and more expensive and maybe even impossible. We've already in the District of Columbia spent millions of dollars to reduce nutrient pollution in the district. This improves water quality here as well as downstream in the Chesapeake Bay. But we also depend on states upstream from us. If the Potomac River is already carrying more pollution when it reaches us, it will be much more difficult for us to obtain our goals. The EPA needs to do its job and enforce the law. Saving that, we'll go to court to make them do so. The district is proud to partner with the colleagues here in the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, especially.
Thank you very much. County Executive Pittman, are you able to join us?
I am, and I believe I'm now unmuted as well.
You are.
Thank you. Thank you, Will Baker and the Chesapeake Bay Foundation as well as the attorneys general for inviting Anne Arundel County to be a part of this lawsuit. You may be wondering why Anne Arundel County is the only local jurisdiction that is participating in this. And the answer is pretty simple, which is that we have a lot at stake. Our very way of life is inextricably tied to the Chesapeake Bay, and it always has been. Our county has 500 miles of shoreline. You can probably see right behind me how that's possible with all of the beautiful streams and inlets and rivers that we have off of the bay. And we have a seafood industry, a restaurant industry, a marine trades industry, and we share the waters with the city of Annapolis, which is in our county, an international destination for boaters and for tourists. So tourists spend about $3.5 billion in our county. Tourism accounts for about 30,000 jobs in our county. So we need to restore the bay to preserve those jobs and our culture and pass along a better environment to our kids. So in terms of investments that our county has put in, we have a stormwater fee that our residents pay. And we're very proud of the work that we've done on stormwater, about $250 million, another $250 million on, for a total of $500 million spent on our wastewater treatment plants. And we've made real progress. And we actually believe that we can meet our TMDL goals. So we have no plans to stop these investments. We will continue this work. But as the leader of the county, I cannot continue to ask our residents to invest this type of money when Pennsylvania and New York are not doing the same. So Anne Arundel County is obviously downstream. We are pretty far downstream in this watershed, and we can't do this alone. The EPA is there to ensure that we all play our part, and that a county like ours down at the end is not polluted by lack of action in New York and Pennsylvania and up the Susquehanna. So that's why Congress passed the Clean Waters Act. That's why EPA created the Chesapeake Bay Cleanup Plan. And that's what this lawsuit is all about. So if EPA will not protect Anne Arundel County from pollution pouring down the Susquehanna and washing ashore on our beaches, then we must ask the courts to force them to protect us. So we look forward to working with all these jurisdictions on this lawsuit, and it's unfortunate that we have to do this, but I think we're taking the right steps. So I will turn it back over to John now.
Thank you very much. So just to recap, if you would like to, if you're a reporter and you'd like to ask a question, you need to message me in the chat. Then I will need to unmute you, and you will need to unmute yourself. Are there any questions? Okay, hold on one second. Brad Cudner, I'm not seeing you on my list. Would you have an initials, or what is it? How does your name show? There it is. Okay. If you unmute yourself, you could ask a question. Please identify yourself, your affiliation, and let me know who you'd like to address. Brad, can you unmute yourself? That he does not seem to be joining us. Amina,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this call. Amina Sayed with Bloomberg Industry Group now. I had a question for all the AGs and for Chesapeake Bay Foundation. I wanted to know, this notice of intent to sue is just for EPA. And I understand in January, Maryland had indicated that it would sue Pennsylvania as well. So are there any plans to go after Maryland and Pennsylvania and New York as well, apart from EPA? And if not, why not? Is there some legal complication involved? Could you please explain? Thank you.
Who would you like to address that?
Maryland Attorney General, Virginia Attorney General, District, everybody who's on, whoever wants to take it first.
Why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I'll start. So, I mean, this is in part and perhaps in whole, our effort to hold our neighbors accountable, to get them to contribute to the health of the Bay. And doing it in a coalition like this, I think, is probably the most effective means of achieving that end. EPA bears responsibility for failing to enforce the law, to enforce the Chesapeake Bay Agreement. And our neighbors, Pennsylvania and New York, need to adjust and improve their conduct with respect to the Bay, need to reduce their nitrogen and phosphorus pollution loads that, as County Executive Pittman said, all of us who live downstream suffer from. So we chose this route, first of all, because we have an extremely strong coalition. And second of all, we think it's a reasonably direct way of addressing effectively the concerns that we have as a result of the pollution that is generated north of us.
Thank you. Attorney General Herring or Racine?
If I can just underscore also what General Frosh just said. The agreement requires states to submit plans, and it's really up to the EPA to review those plans and to make sure that they meet our goals. And instead, the Trump EPA has shirked that responsibility and has instead approved plans that don't meet the goals. And so what we're asking EPA to do is do its job and make sure that each state is pulling the weight that they agreed to do. And so this is the way, best way to accomplish that goal, which is to make sure that the Trump EPA does its job and stops shirking its responsibility.
Thank you. Attorney General Racine?
Sure, I would just simply add that, we are quite familiar, of course, and have excellent relationships with the attorneys general from Pennsylvania, that's Josh Shapiro, and from New York, Tish James. And by no means is our action personal as to them. I know that they themselves are strong environmentalists. Oftentimes what a state does is directed by the state legislator, the legislator of that state. Here we've got to do what's best for our residents. And I'm happy, as I indicated earlier, to partner with Brian Frosh and Mark Herring. They represent two states and the District of Columbia who are doing their part in the deal. And we just want to push York and Pennsylvania to do the same. And frankly, we shouldn't have to be doing this because the EPA should be doing it. And so that's what our NOI is all about. It's about accountability to the Trump administration's EPA to really get the states to do what they need to do, just as Virginia, Maryland, and DC are.
Thank you. Will or John, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, thank you, John. I might just say two quick things. First, there are two notices of intent letters. One comes from the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and our partners. The other comes from the states and the District of Columbia, those attorneys general. The other thing I'd like to make sure I emphasize is that EPA has an enforcement role to play. but it also could be of tremendous assistance by rallying the federal agencies who are part of this agreement to direct more of the funding to Pennsylvania and New York to help farmers put in the practices they want to put in to reduce pollution by keeping the soil on their land and the chemicals that are in that soil. So we think USDA and EPA could play an enormous role in helping Pennsylvania and New York, the upstream states, by directing more federal money to it. That would be another part of what we would see as their role under the agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Next up, we have Carol Vaughn.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, speaking as from the Eastern Shore, which is way downstream, I guess my question is for either the CBF folks and/or Attorney General Herring, if he wants to weigh in. Do these notices or address at all, or what are specific concerns about the effects on the rather significant aquaculture industry in Virginia, which is mostly based on the Eastern Shore?
So I would say, first of all, the notices of intent signify that we take this very, very seriously, and that we believe the Trump administration's EPA is shirking its responsibility and that they need to step up and do their job, and that it sets in motion a conversation, hopefully, where EPA will reassess its position and begin to do what they should have done months ago. The concerns are that by approving plans that do not meet the goals, that we will not meet our goals to clean up the Chesapeake Bay, which has a huge impact on Virginia's economy. It generates billions of dollars, whether it's in the seafood and fishing industry, aquaculture, or whether it is in tourism or other types of industries. And so the goal is to protect the Chesapeake Bay, save the Chesapeake Bay, and help make sure that the livelihoods, people whose livelihoods depend on the health of the bay, and that the recreational benefits and the cultural benefits of this, of one of the world's most important estuaries, is protected and saved.
Thank you. Any of the other panelists want to comment, or should we move on? Next up, we have Steve Davies.
Great, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I was just wondering, EPA has keeps saying that the TMDL is just informational, that there isn't the kind of enforcement that you're talking about. Can you say, this is really for John Mueller, can you say what the legal underpinnings are for your suit? Not just the blueprint, but any legal precedent that you might be citing here.
Right. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, that's a good question, because that was one of the first things they did when they were questioned about Dana Honk's statement after the Bay Commission meeting in January that, read our brief in the Farm Bureau case. Well, what they need to do is read the Third Circuit opinion in the Farm Bureau case. And this is not a normal TMDL like the 40,000 others that have been issued across the country. Only the Chesapeake Bay has Section 117G of the Clean Water Act that requires EPA to take action and make certain that plans are developed and maintained to meet the goals of the Bay Agreement. EPA signed the Bay Agreement in 2014 that says we adopt the goals of the Bay TMDL and the deadline of 2025. So this is not, one of the great slides that were used back in development of the TMDL is by EPA itself, staff telling the states, this is not your grandfather's TMDL. This is a different beast. So we believe 117G provides that legal underpinning on top of Section 303D of the Act.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Sarah Vogelsong. Did you unmute yourself, Sarah?
Yeah, my question was actually already asked, so thank you very much.
We were going to try Brad Cutner again. We had a little technical issue with that. Brad, are you with us? Can you unmute yourself?
Brad indicated in the chat that his question has been answered, John, so we can move on to the next person.
Great. Next up, we have Annie Snyder.
Hi, are you able to hear me?
Yes, we do.
Great. So given the timing of this litigation, it seems unlikely that we would see the lawsuit play out within the Trump administration's first term. If we were to see a change in administration in January, what would you consider pausing the litigation or ending it? Where would you expect to proceed from there?
Well, this is Will Baker. As the one organization that sued EPA for failure to enforce the Clean Water Act previously, we did so at the end of the Bush administration, and then we continued that lawsuit at the beginning of the Obama administration. And fortunately, we were able to settle that lawsuit, and that was partially the origin of the current TMDL. We call it the Chesapeake Clean Water Blueprint. So we would have no reason to drop the lawsuit, but we would certainly be as willing to negotiate with the new administration as we will be willing to negotiate with the Trump administration if they want to meet the requirements of the law and the requirements of Congress as we've articulated.
Thank you, Will. Daryl Fears.
Thank you for holding the call, and thank you for taking my question. I'm Daryl Fears with the Washington Post. All of my questions have been answered as well, except one, and that the AGs know, if everyone talks about investment in the Chesapeake Bay cleanup plan that states Virginia, DC, and Maryland. How much money have the states invested in the cleanup plan since its initiation in any of the AGs can take this question. Actually, all three, if they know the answer.
We lost the middle of that, Daryl. How much money? And then we lost some of it.
Yeah, how much have Virginia, Maryland, and the district invested in the cleanup plan since it was initiated?
Is the question how much of Maryland, DC, and Virginia invested in the Chesapeake Bay?
Yes, I believe so.
Since 2010.
Since 2010.
And any of the AGs can take, all three of the AGs can take this question.
Let me start. I don't know a precise number for the past 10 years, but I can tell you it's significant, not just in terms of expenditures. I mean, the General Assembly and the governor invest a tremendous amount of money directly into making sure that the Chesapeake Bay is cleaned up and preserved. But there are all kinds of other actions that we've taken to ensure that Chesapeake Bay's health, and they relate to things like reducing the amount of pollution that come from utilities and other businesses in the air and in the water, in setting standards for clean air, clean water, that while they're not directly paid by the state, cost the state because the businesses that we have here have to pay the cost. When a utility is reducing its pollution, it adds to its expenses. That gets passed on to Maryland's consumers. So you have probably hundreds of millions over the past decade in direct investment and a lot more in terms of the costs to the citizens of the state and its businesses through additional environmental protections.
I'll say also on Virginia's behalf, while I don't have an exact number either, it is significant. Some of it is direct investment from the state, but it's also working with our localities to make sure that stormwater management regulations are effectively addressing sediment runoff. It is working with localities to make sure that we are reducing pollution from water pollution from wastewater treatment plants. It means that we work with our agricultural industry. So there are all kinds of ways in which Virginia is investing to protect the health of the Bay, in addition to direct appropriations from the General Assembly.
And let me add on behalf of the District of Columbia that I'm happy to get you the best number from the Department of the Energy and the Environment. But I know the money is well into the millions. We'll get that information and we'll pass it on to John Surrick. So you can follow up with John.
Hi, this is a question for Attorney General Frosh. Can you describe any talks with the EPA since the Bay Program Administrator said in January that he, and I guess the agency, would consider these goals aspirational going forward? Have there been any talks?
There've not been direct talks between me and the EPA administrator. Our Department of Environment and Secretary Ben Grumbles, who endorses and supports this effort, I believe is in constant contact with the EPA. But frankly, when we heard that comment, I think it was abundantly clear that EPA was not going to enforce this agreement. Our interchanges with them for the past 3.5 years have been fraught and unsuccessful. As I said previously, EPA has sought to undermine every environmental protection it can find, all relating to air, all relating to water. They've attacked, they have reduced the standards that apply to virtually every polluter, whether it's through air pollution or water pollution, and their enforcement efforts have lagged as well. So no, our office is not engaged in direct conversations with the EPA in the hopes that somehow the statement that this was aspirational would be converted into one in which they actually enforce the law.
Thank you. County Executive Pittman is going to be leaving us momentarily. Does anyone have a question for him? I guess that's it. And that's sort of a wrap on the questions that we have in the chat. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, especially the Attorneys General, County Executive Pittman, Will, and John. Again, the recording of this will be up in about an hour at cbf.org/NOICALL. Any other questions? You can feel free to reach out to me later.
Thank you all very much.
Final thoughts from any of the panelists, or are we good?
Yes, John, I would like to say one thing. We're already seeing on social media out of Pennsylvania a rhetorical question of why doesn't the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, at least, I imagine this might apply to the states and the district also, why don't you spend your money on something else besides litigation? Well, I think I can speak for all of us who are on this call. We have brought this letter of intent to sue, which is not litigation, as the very last resort after years, really decades of patience. And for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, we have raised hundreds of thousands of dollars, really millions of private money to be spent in Pennsylvania to improve water quality in Pennsylvania also for the benefit of the bay downstream. So we take this action as a very last resort because we really are at the point where if it's not done now, it may never be done. And to reiterate, it's a letter of intent. EPA holds the reins. They don't have to allow this they can stop this litigation from going through by simply complying with the law by enforcing the Clean Water Act. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Will. There's one more question from Lancaster Farming. They're not able to give it to you themselves, but they'd like to know from you, Will Baker. With the coronavirus likely to increase costs and reduce tax revenue for state government, is it reasonable to expect that Pennsylvania to increase its financial commitments to the Bay cleanup in the next year or two?
Let's make this very clear. This has nothing to do with a specific dollar amount. This has to do with Pennsylvania and New York making the water quality in their streams and rivers safe for their own residents. And that will improve the Bay downstream and other rivers and streams downstream. So any way you want to do it, if you want to throw money at it, you can do that. If you want to do incentives or disincentives, you can do it that way. We're looking at a metric of clean water, not a metric of money.
Thank you. Attorney General Herring, did you have any final thoughts you wanted to give?
No, I just wanted to say thank you to all of the Bay partners. And this is all about holding the Trump administration's EPA responsible for what it is supposed to do under the law. And hopefully this notice of intent will cause EPA to rethink its position and begin to follow the law like it's supposed to do. As Will said, they're leaving us with no choice. Hopefully that they will come around and see that they need to follow the law. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. Attorney General Frosh, any parting words?
I think both Will and Mark have covered everything that I just say I'm proud to be allied with these fine people, these great attorneys general, Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and County Executive Pittman.
Thank you very much. And that concludes our Zoom call. Again, any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. The letter J, like John, Surrick, SURRICK, @cbf.org. Thank you again.